back for the seventh part of our exhaustive study of melodic black metal. We're still in 1994. This is the third part of 1994, and we're getting to the last third of the year. If you've been watching these in succession, we're basically building up to a couple of important full lengths. The end of the year, the last half of the year, is generally where traditionally bigger releases hit. There was a lot more going on in 1994. There were much bigger releases outside of melodic black metal in terms of just black metal hitting as a thing and getting more notice in 1994 for obvious reasons. This is sort of the apex of precedence, and we're finally in 1995. We'll push beyond that point. We've gotten some important albums in 1994 and a couple in 1993, but we've only really just started this exploration. Generally speaking, we're getting to the point where we can distinguish between melodic black metal and melodic death metal, and melodic black death metal and black metal and death metal are really doing their best to separate from each other in other scenes in other areas. Whereas you'll find a lot of the bands that I've mentioned along the way, they were the ones that were a lot of the times at the forefront of blurring black metal and death metal into one thing. It wasn't something that needed to be defined, and there was a lot of nuance on both sides. It might seem cut and dry in hindsight, but again, a lot of this, the interesting thing about the development of melodic black metal as a style is that there was death metal in it. So that's going to be less of a point as we find more exemplar releases in this style, and we find a couple here. As far as a band that really does blur that line between black metal, death metal, a little bit of dark metal and doom in there too, is Christ Agony's second full-length album, Damu and Seth Act 2. It's a direct follow-up to the first record. It has much better production values, and this is the most representative release from the early band in terms of realizing the intent of the demos, the broad spectrum of subgenres covered, and the production values they were working up towards along the way. Now, the quality of the production doesn't matter as much. You'll probably hear a remastered version of this if you do hear it. What does matter is recognizing the multiple stylistic indicators and all the enthusiasm for extreme metal in general that feeds into Christ Agony's sound. To most people, this does amount to a melodic black metal album, probably the closest that they ever got to that definition in the way that it had been accumulating from 1990 until now. This record is otherwise, it's got a little bit of Samael, it's got a little bit of gothic metal, there's certainly some death metal in its movement, but I would say that if we pull together everything that defined what black metal was up until this point and excuse some of the overbearing Norwegian dominance of the genre at this point in 1994, we get a good example of everything that black metal was otherwise. Now, of course, I'd rather probably talk about a Master's Hammer record or something that was just completely out of the ordinary, but as far as a well-rounded black metal album, probably one of the most interesting examples that a lot of people have overlooked over the years, and I've been a huge fan of this band ever since kind of discovering their first three records. So that's most of what I'll cover for Christ Agony is up through the third or maybe fourth record, and after that point, we'll kind of move on to other things. But I think this is an important one to say. If you're going to listen to any Christ Agony record, the first is one of my favorites personally. The second one is an extension of that record, maybe a little bit more professional, better played. The musicianship had kind of stepped up. After this point, we find that the lineup changed, and that core trio who'd been working for so long at this thing kind of finally met their initial goal. So pretty classic record in terms of Polish black metal. Maybe not the style that you're maybe used to hearing about in the early days. It doesn't sound like Graveland or Behemoth necessarily, but this should be a surprise to anyone who just hasn't taken the recommendation yet. I think this is the one that might convince you that this band is pretty cool. Now, in terms of Norwegian black metal, Gehenna were always a little bit of an outlier. I wouldn't say that their work was necessarily defined before this first EP came out. First Spell is a keyboard-driven, atmospheric and melodic record that puts the keyboards first in terms of crafting melody, and you'll find that the musicianship is still a little bit all over the place as the remnants of their demo and 7-inch fine definition beyond that point. And anytime over the years you've seen me talk about the early days of Black Magic SS or Falkenbach, or those were bands and records that sort of came from me discovering this band a long time ago, just through this EP. There is a heavy metal component to this. There's a lot of trivia attached to this record. Most people are more excited to talk about their first full-length album, but for me, this kind of qualifies as the beginning of Gehenna as we know them, and just one of my favorite records in this style because it just has a certain mysticism to it. It feels superior to a lot of what was going on at the time, and it's very different than your usual expectations of Norwegian black metal in 1994. So this just felt like something extra, something different, and it was sort of a launching pad for some better-known artists. Very much worth knowing and having. So while a lot of bands had deep roots in melodic black metal and melodic death metal starting in the late 80s, there were still bands that were novel and at work on their underground second generation that was going on beneath that, and Midwinter were sort of a part of that. They had totally different bands in mind at the time. They started Applegon, which is more of a death metal band, and Midwinter, which is much more of a black metal band with a melodic tendency up from the start. They formed in 1993, and this demo tape, gives you a sense of the sophistication of the guitarist, the whole conception of the band, and the melodic style that they would extend into their full length. Now, if you know their 1997 full length, you know that is a very much an esoteric black metal record. It is a melodic black death metal record in most ways, and it's an often overlooked record for just being a bit strange, a bit of the moment. It never sounded like they were prepared to go into the studio for that record. Part of that is just that this was a band, and their compositions were just always all over the place. I would suggest you go listen to Applegon, Melect House, and get that precedence and that for what else they were doing around this time, because there was obviously a lot of inspiration going into their craft at the time. They were very excited to be participating in this thing that was happening, and they had a lot of novel ideas. Especially this demo has probably the more notable melodic ideas of their that would show up on their full length. A lot of these songs will become more fleshed out or exaggerated on the full length. So I think that before we talk about that record, we have to talk about this demo in terms of the specific songs that they extend and change, and the atmosphere that they've sort of carried through, rethought as they approach the full length. So this is sort of a preamble to a much bigger thing, and probably the only thing that the band would be known for. For me, this is just one of those essential demos that I was excited to find back in the day, and deserves to be mentioned. So if you remember me talking about Invocation and their Greek black death metal sound, they did a split with Medieval Demon, an Athens, Greece-based band that formed back in 1992, and this is a band that are still around today. They reformed at some point in the last several years, and they put out 2 or 3 albums since then. They did have a history of maybe late 90s and early 2000s work that they put out in a similar style to what we find in their demos. This is maybe much more of the scene, but maybe a little bit different. There's a certain violent and aggressive charm to this tape and its many versions. The precedence here is not that this is an outwardly melodic or black metal band. I don't think that in the Greek scene this was particularly melodic as per what was going on at the time. It's more that this is an example. This is a way to introduce the band, basically. It's also a way to show the maybe an over-the-top outlier in the Greek black metal scene in Athens, as well as just a band that would develop more melodic ideas over time, but never be outwardly melodic. Overall, I thought this was worth mentioning because it has a certain aesthetic, it has a certain feeling and intent to it that is relevant to the conversation, but maybe not outwardly melodic in a way that you'll necessarily outside of the conversation of just black metal. I still wanted to mention it. I think this is a cool inclusion. There is good reason that a band like Naglfar are still remembered and revered in terms of melodic black metal of a certain era. I would say melodic black death metal in most respects. Just like Cythereal, they were still kind of transitioning away from their death metal origins into black metal on this tape, and we find that these were very enthusiastic folks who were part of a lot of groups at the time. We find people who are still active today, like Jens Ryden, involved in this very professional demo tape, and they even had a promo version for reviewers tours that they put out before they put out the official tape. So it was kind of like they put out an album here with this tape and did a press tour with it and everything. Stelle Trajectio introduces a lot of the very strong melodic ideas that would have show up on their debut full length. This was very much a promotional demo for what they would do next, and I've never found there was any real justification for why this band were passed off as sort of like a dissection alike clone, a no fashion style band. What they were doing was always kind of different, and their treatment of melody was maybe more of a precursor to what a lot of the catchier melodic death metal bands were doing at the time, but they still translated into melodic black death metal, or just melodic black metal in this case. Draw those distinctions wherever you feel like it. I feel like this is just one of the more notable demo tapes of this era, especially of this year. It's very professionally made. The production is pretty strong, even though the drums are programmed. It's not very noticeable in the mix. This is a surprisingly sophisticated, well-prepared production. It was very professional for its time, and we sort of see Agafar putting a best foot forward in a way that we just really haven't seen outside of maybe Cethereal and a few others, but those were still collecting bits and pieces, and this feels like a very targeted demo tape, and I think it's very much worth mentioning. A little bit infamous in some circles, but a collector's item from my point of view. Needless to say that at this point there were leaders and there were followers at this point, and Rotting Christ they could have only been seen as leaders in what they were doing, not only because Non Serviam, their second full-length album, was so driven by a unique, very much original guitar style and sound, but because they were doing so much at the time. Thou Art Lord had their debut nearby, very much in a similar way of composition, but a different style, much more pure black metal in that band. On Non Serviam, this is a very focused band going into the studio and getting to know themselves better. They were very much focused on Levan Satanism. They were channeling these dark nights, coming up with this very original album, and it feels like this was sort of the peak personal development of Rotting Christ, the stealing visionary work that got them going. And because of production values and certain tics of the way that they developed their style, this was always difficult for a lot of people to approach, even though it was so distinctly melodic and very much a very much finesse in black metal that we just didn't see anywhere else at the time. We could look to the way that Samael had developed, which was in distinct contrast to this slick melodic style of Non Serviam. So those were two records I discovered at the same time, and this was just a beautiful thing for me. It was just so different than everything I'd heard. You know, everyone else was listening to like Nirvana at the time, and this was something that was completely alien, and in a lot of ways helped to introduce me to black metal in general. This is a classic from my point of view. A lot of people would feel that the next album does this and does it better. I would agree that they're related in terms of how they develop melody and guitar technique, but this one, it kind of did it first. There's a logical step taken in each of the first four Rotting Christ full lengths, and you can see them realizing their vision slowly over time. Otherwise, of course, this is undeniable importance to melodic black metal, but it's also a very important record for Hellenic black metal, even though there are not a lot of records that ever attempted this type of sound with any real success. So much like Midwinter, the folks behind the Moaning were basically, they had their hands in a lot of jars, and essentially this started out as a death metal band, had a couple of different names, and eventually the membership came to include a certain number of people, and they put together this promo tape. And essentially what a lot of the tapes were doing at this point, instead of trying to put out like a full album's worth of material and sell the experience, they were putting out their best songs, the catchiest, biggest hooks they would convince that they had more to give. And so this tape really hones in on a couple of their biggest moments that would eventually lead into some pieces on their first full-length album a couple years later. I think the notable thing is that the sound here is reflective of the style that I would say was cultivated between bands like Gates of Ishtar and a Canaris Quintet, where there was a maybe more of a lower fidelity production. It was very mid-range focused on a lot of its mix, and I'll get into more of that once those albums show up and this band's debut shows up. But this is a melodic black death metal band where they weren't quite drawing the line and they fit in really well with No Fashion. It wasn't like they were really forcing any death metal out, but there was that gray area where the initial idea of melodic death metal was still there, but black metal was overtaking their sound almost in process. There's a lot to like about this demo in terms of just showing a couple of their initial ideas. It's not the most in-depth demo, it's pretty short, and it just gives us a taste of what this band would be about soon. The notable song here is probably Blackened by Death. It shows they were just kind of having fun with their songwriting and nothing was definite yet. So not the absolute best foot forward for the band, and they had other projects I think they were more focused on over the years beyond. This is a good way of introducing that their sole full length would show up in a number of years, and much like Midwinter, it would play to the crowd that it was focused on. So the interesting thing about a band like Profanity is that they were labeled as a Viking death metal band early on, and I think it always took away from what they actually were. They started out as a very aggressive black metal band, one that was it still had, like a lot of Swedish bands at the time, there was still a little bit of death metal in their vernacular, but it wasn't that important to what they were doing. This wasn't necessarily, a lot of people describe their work as similar to earlier Marduk, and I think that fits. There's a little bit of Bathory, there's a little bit of thrash, maybe even Dawn would make sense to throw in there. As we look through all of their tapes, this is probably the best one to start with. It's the most clear production values, the most focused songwriting, very stylized demo that's very professional looking. We get a sense that this band was something a little bit different, and I compare them to Twin Obscenity because there is that sort of blackened death metal feeling. There's the pure black metal feeling. That there's a confusion between those definitions that is really good. It's a very aggressive style that they've come up with here, and I feel like this is overlooked because they never quite went anywhere with it. And I won't spoil the progression of this band. They have some ups and downs over the following years. There just wasn't anywhere that they fully went with it. There was no ending to their story necessarily. But the early work of this really should have been expanded upon what they started out with. Just a kind of an outlier here, and there is some strong melodic ideas. They would become more melodic over time, and we'll get into that when we get there. So more often than not, Covenant are remembered for winning, I think, a Spellman Prison, and being compared to the early days of Dimmu Borgir and whatnot. And I think that makes sense because they were eventually known for symphonic black metal, symphonic melodic black metal, if you will. They sort of became an industrial metal band later on. They put out 2 records that are very well known for their contribution to late 90s symphonic black metal, and where they start with this demo tape is maybe a little bit more primitive. It is typically seen as symphonic because of the sound of the keyboards, but I don't think their intent was much more than a melodic style of black metal. This was a pretty dark demo tape, and one that is not quite as notable as maybe like the first Old Man's Child demo tape, but it still is kind of along those lines. It has that sense of strong compositional skills and very practiced playing in most ways, but still a pretty primitive start. Ancient's debut full-length album, Svartalheim, is a great example of, well, I think an album that has classically been approached from a superficial angle. It is often only approached for its first song or first 2 songs. The depth of the album it's much more than its first couple of songs, which have a sort of raw and simple playing style, because there's some earlier songs that start out that kick off the album. They give a sort of raw and aggressive side to it, and a lot of people lump Ancient into the general Norwegian black metal wilderness, and I don't think that fits. I think this was a particularly atmospheric and melodic band. I think this had there was a dramatism to it. There was something extra about this record that was a little bit mysterious and different, and I think that's often overlooked, and this band is sort of trampled over in a lot of ways. And I always felt like this was something that was, just never quite given its due, even though it has the band has been noticed and noted since then. This is a good place to start with their discography and start to mention where they stood out a little bit. Songs like The Call of the Absu Deep, they showed that there was more to the band, and it sort of lined up with my interest in Hellenic black metal at the time. Going a little deeper with an album like this reveals a fully different character than what is expected off of the first couple of tracks. Maybe that's me just more suggesting that there is more to a record like this, even if it's seen as a minor classic or a side note or whatever. Create a little bit of a conundrum here by starting out with the second Grand Belial's Key demo, because the second demo was quite a bit different from the first. The first was sort of, I think it was 1992, a more extended demo that had a sort of a different focus, and they developed that sound here for the second record in a very different way. I don't know how to, I don't think the band likes this demo based on what people have written about it and different interviews over the years, but basically this was what a lot of people saw as maybe a little bit more of a Scandinavian influence to their sound, maybe less of the typical USBM sound as people have seen it in hindsight. A lot of the signatures that you'll find in Grand Belial's Key are sort of here, but this was sort of the pre-Kaz Grant era of this band, and it had a different, less distinct sound in some ways. I think what we do get is the work of Necrosodomy's guitar work. What we do get here is basically Necrosodomy's guitar work finding its stride, finding its focus, and that's the only thing that really bleeds through of interest. There are some very dramatic songs here. There are some there's sort of a heavy rock, traditional heavy metal touch to his guitar work that carries through this release. As soon as the fellow from Crucifier would join and the vocalist drummer here, Lord Vlad Luciferian, would leave the band around the same time. So I figured this is a good place to start with this band, just because it introduces some of the melodic intent of their work. It introduces an early Pagan Records release, and also it sort of shows us partially where the band started and how they refined that approach going forward. So as you'll have seen throughout this this part of our exploration, we're introducing a lot of bands that were better known later on, and showing that where they started wasn't necessarily where they became noticed. And there's no better example of holding back and not showing all your cards than this first 7-inch from Dimmu Borgir. In 1994, this band put out like 4 rehearsals. They're all been well documented. You can go and check out all of those, and you'll find that they were not great when they started out. In terms of playing and songwriting, they couldn't really write a riff that was all that interesting. But they did have some pretty strong and inventive songs and a plethora of ideas to push into their first full length. And none of that is really echoed here on this 7-inch, which is mostly atmospheric. It's very deliberate, slow, and luminous in the way that it crafts its sound and its effect. In some ways, this is a pretty conceptually interesting and very aesthetic beginning for this band, but it doesn't at all prepare us for their debut full length. And this is a very restrained 7-inch that only shows a couple of their cards, which involve simple epic black metal feeling arrangements and slow keyboards. And I think this is not a very ambitious set of songs, but still something worth talking about, I guess, in introducing Dimmu Borgir and their early phase, which is very different from what they became popular for later on. So basically from this point, we can consider this season 1, 1990 to 1994, is essentially the beginnings of melodic black metal. And the next set of coverage will basically be season 2. It'll be 1995 to about 2000, and we'll see where we go from there. We'll see how popular these videos and articles were, and I'll sort of take stock with the time commitment to see if that's worth it. If you did enjoy these first set of 7 videos and written articles, if you want more of this, let me know and I'll continue on with it. Otherwise, for the next several months, I'll be covering a more thrash metal focused series